there should be some buildup to sharing certain things in certain contexts, or like in a small group situations, like when you're just starting out with a small group of people, new people that you're hoping maybe will potentially form some lifelong friendships. I don't know. Most groups begin with the first night, the getting to know you part, and there's always that opportunity for people to share their stories. That's how you get to know each other. And maybe you've had this experience, like you don't know each other, very, very well. And so the first person tells their story. Typically, it's very G-rated. The second person is a little PG, maybe the a little PG-13. The fourth person, like there's a little bit of R in there. And then by the time it gets all the way around, the first person, the first couple is like, okay, I need to go again because I left some stuff out. I didn't know we were going to go like this deep or this far, this fast. Uh, and so you typically you build up to the point to where you really begin to talk about some of those maybe less than great moments in your life, those less than stellar decisions that you made, maybe some of those embarrassing moments. But typically there's a buildup to these things because you go, if you go out of order, you go too far too fast. Sometimes there's no second meeting, or suddenly they just can't make it to your group anymore, or things, you get things out of order in life. There's no second date, there's no second job interview, there's no sale, no contract, no future together. You get things out of order, and the next thing you know, your neighbor is building a higher fence next to you. And the reason why I bring this up is because apparently nobody reminded Matthew about this. Matthew, one of Jesus's 12 chosen closest disciples, who was an eyewitness to everything, the life, the teachings, the betrayal, the miracles, the arrest, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, who brings us an account of Jesus. Because in making his case for the identity of Jesus, he doesn't begin with like a warm, touching birth narrative, Mary and Joseph and sweet baby Jesus in a manger and a star and a wise man. And he doesn't begin with the birth narrative. He actually begins with the genealogy, as we've seen, a linear family tree of Jesus's ancestors. A father who had a son, who had a son, who had a son. And as we've seen, periodically, he goes unnecessarily out of his way to air some of the dirty laundry of Jesus's ancestors, which, especially considering his primary audience, which was Jewish people, would feel like that it hurts his case more than it helps us. And when I say it's his case, this is so important, especially if you're just new to reading the Bible, or you're new to faith. In the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew wasn't just telling a story about Jesus. Matthew was building a case for the identity of Jesus. It's in the opening line of his gospel. He says, this is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. The Hebrew word means anointed one, or somebody who's been anointed king. The Greek version of this word is Christ. So Christ is not Jesus' last name, it's a title. Anointed one, Jesus the King, Jesus the Christ, Jesus, God's final king. Now, for the ancient Jews, this was a big deal, because if Matthew is going to make the case that Jesus is God's son, God's final king, then he also has to make the case that Jesus is related to what Israel would have considered their greatest king, King David. And to the Jewish people, this was Matthew's primary target. So Matthew says up front that this is a genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, Israel's most famous king. Some would argue Israel's greatest king. And there's 14 generations between David and Jesus that were accounted for. So Matthew gives us a flyover of these 14 generations. So to set this up for where we're going today, just a little bit of backstory. I've got to give you a little bit of backstory about King David. Like this is David, like David and Goliath. And David lived 1000 BC, so about 1,000 years before Jesus. He came onto the scenes as a giant killer. Then he goes on his way to become a mighty warrior who becomes Israel's second king. He settles all the regional disputes between Israel and the surrounding nations and territories. He settles all of the borders. He sets up commerce and trade. He brings peace to all of that land. And as he gets older, he's accomplished so much, and it hits him one day. All these pagan nations around me, they've got temples to their gods. And our God doesn't have a temple. So David decides, I'm going to build like the greatest temple in the world to our God. So he starts making plans to build a temple. God sends a prophet named Nathan to David. And Nathan shows up and says, okay, I've got a word from the Lord. He doesn't really want a temple. He doesn't really need a temple. But if there's going to be a temple, you can't build it because you've got too much blood on your hands. You are a warrior king. And there's so much of the story that I don't have time to go into, but essentially, God, through the prophet, he did warn him. He says, now, if you try to build this box and put me in this box, it's going to create problems. Because the problem with the temple is that the temple, in the minds of the people, would begin to represent, well, that's where God is. That's the presence of God. God is over there in his little house. He's in his little box. So since God's over there in his box, that means that I can go over here and essentially do whatever I want. And in fact, in American Christianity, this kind of permeated kind of the thought process for a lot of individuals, for millions. It's, for millions of Christians and even agnostics, well, God's located in a building. We call it a church. So you go to church, you go to the box. I mean, some denominations, it's referred to as God's house. And so maybe you were presented or raised with a version of Christianity like, this is God's house, so this is where God is. And so the downside of that is somehow mentally you can put God in his box until there's a crisis or until you need something. And then mentally or somehow in your mind, you say, I've got a need, I've got a crisis. And so you get your God box or you go to a church building or you mentally take that box off the shelf and open it up and say, okay, God, now I need you. Now I need a favor. Like he's a genie in a bottle, which is why at some point in your past or in your life, you walked away from church because Christianity just wasn't working for you. Or you saw too many Christians where it was clear they had God in a box because then they would just do whatever they wanted, treat people the way they wanted. You just like, I can't be a part of that version of this faith. But the great news is that God doesn't live in a box and he can't be contained. And as we're going to see, his presence, his grace, and his mercy is so big. It's just astounding. The prophet Nathan says to David, okay, God says it's okay. The temple's going to be built, even though I don't need one, I don't necessarily want one, but you can't build it, your son will. And this is important. But along with this, he says to David, God has a message for you. David, here's the message for you. And again, this is about 1,000 years before Jesus. He says, I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth. So this was 3,000 years ago. So just quick survey, just a quick show of hands. Everyone play along. Before you arrived here today, how many of you had heard of David? Okay, so this came true. Like what he said happened. And here's what God promises. He says, your throne, which represents your power and your influence, will be established forever. Now again, we don't have time to cover all the history, but the kings that followed just essentially blew things up for the nation because they were corrupt, they were immoral, they were evil, they consistently rebelled against God. And by the time Jesus shows up, for hundreds and hundreds of years, there was no one on an earthly throne. And so much time had gone by that many Jewish people just began to feel like this isn't even a reality. It's a story, it's a myth. But there was a remnant of people who took this promise to mean that eventually God would send his final king, a Messiah, the anointed one, that would be in the line of David. So that's why Matthew goes into this detailed, meticulous genealogy. Because when Jesus came along, Israel actually had a king, King Herod, but King Herod wasn't even Jewish, not even in the slightest. And so a lot of Jews had just given up. So Matthew states his thesis. His thesis is Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. He's from the lineage of David, from the lineage of Abraham. So he begins a boring genealogy of names that mean nothing to most of us. But the fact is it's so far from boring as we've seen in this series, and it's about to get even less boring today, which is why we have kids and kids ministry. Tamar and Judah were week one. His first highlight of these embarrassing people in Jesus' genealogy were Tamar. Tamar was the daughter-in-law who had tricked her father-in-law into getting her pregnant. The baby's name was Perez, and their son Perez is actually in the line of Jesus, the Messiah. There was Rahab, the prostitute, who was a descendant of David, named Salmon, married after the fall of Jericho. She helped the Hebrew spies. She hid them before the invasion of the city. And then last week we talked about her. And the problem is she was both Canaanite and a prostitute. And Jewish law prohibited such a marriage. And yet she's in the lineage of Jesus, even though her child, this child with an Israelite, was considered that of a mixed race. And then we don't get very far before we bump into another woman in a list of 40 men. Matthew 1, verse 5. Salmon fathered Boaz by Rahab, the prostitute. We talked about it last week. Boaz fathered Obed by, and now we have another mother in a list of fathers, Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Now, we said throughout this series that whenever Matthew introduces a woman into this male genealogy, it's because he wants us to stop, he wants us to pause, and he wants us to remember the story that is connected to that particular woman, and he wants to draw our attention to Ruth. Now, if you grew up in church, or you're familiar with Ruth, he doesn't want to draw his attention to us because of the beautiful story that maybe you have heard about Ruth. And it is a beautiful story about Ruth meets Boaz. They fall in love. Boaz becomes the protector. He saves her from poverty. It's just a beautiful love story. But Matthew's like, okay, that's not why I want to draw your attention to Ruth. Here's why I want to draw your attention to Ruth. Because like Rahab, Ruth is not an Israelite. Ruth is a Moabite. And here's the part that did not teach you in Sunday school, and I saw the Veggie Tales. It's not in there, okay? Ruth is a Moabite. And the Moabites were a small nation of people who lived in what we would consider modern-day Jordan. But do you know the shocking origin story of the Moabites? No, you don't. So I'm going to tell you. Because Matthew wants us to go, okay, wow, I did not see that coming. In fact, I could have just gone my whole life without even knowing that. So here's the story. The one who God used to start all of this was Abram, whose name is later changed to Abraham, renamed Abraham. Now, years later, at one point in the story, he's got a nephew named Lot. And his Lot lived in Sodom. Now, most of you know something about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And before God lights things up, Lot escapes with his wife and his daughters, and his wife almost makes it, but she makes a decision that ends up costing her her life. So now Sodom and Gomorrah are burning. There's like burning and sulfur everywhere and smoke. It's like the world's coming to an end. So he escapes with his daughters. The whole world's coming apart. They flee into the mountains where they find the cave, and they go in there. They're escaping the chaos. They settle in. Well, time goes by. And his daughters are thinking, wow, this is our new reality. We're going to spend the rest of our lives in this cave with our father. And this is not in the text, but when you read the story, it becomes clear that from their vantage point, it looks like they might be the last people left on earth. They don't know. But they say, we're never going to have a husband, which means they're never going to have children. And these two women wanted children because, especially in this time and in this culture, a woman without a child in those days was considered cursed. And it was dangerous. You needed children, especially a son, for security. And so here's what these two young women do. They get their dad good and drunk 2 nights in a row. One goes in one night, one goes in the next night. They do the deed with him, but he's so drunk, he can't remember. He remembers nothing. And here's the passage again. Nobody has memorized. Nobody's put this on their fridge or their bathroom mirror. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and here's why this is important to our story today. She named him Moab, and he is the father of the Moabites of today. And generations later, in the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, we are introduced to Ruth the Moabite. The great times 22 grandmother of Jesus, God's Son, God's Messiah, God's final King. Merry Christmas. It's like, okay, we were not taught that as kids, and what Veggie Tales is way off, left that out. I just would have been fine going the rest of my life not knowing that little detail, but blame it on Matthew, because Matthew is the one who draws our attention to it, to a woman who technically, ethically, morally, and even by ancient standards should never have been born. Which should be good news for some of us if we've ever considered ourselves like we were just an accident, we should never have happened. No. You're the image of God. And Matthew wants you to know that before he unfolds the story of Jesus. And so then he moves us back into the boring part for a second. Boaz fathered Obed by Ruth. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered King David. And there he is. arguably the most important person in this list. So surely, Matthew, you're not going to do anything to draw any negative attention to David. I mean, the whole point of your document is you're trying to make the case that Jesus is God's final king, and his relationship to David is of a paramount importance, right? So surely Matthew isn't going to go there, but he does. And here's how he does it. He says David was the father of Solomon, and then he doesn't name the mother. He just says whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And most of you know the story, and some of you don't, but Matthew doesn't want us to skip this story. He knows that all of his Jewish readers in the first century would read this. They would already know this story. Most of you already know this story. Matthew's like, you need to feel the incident that brought about this baby that was in the lineage of Jesus. This matters. Don't attempt to sanitize or glamorize or try to remove the gritty, earthy family history of your king. He's just right in our face. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been, to put it plainly and just twist the knife, another man's wife, until David abused his power. Where we're told one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of his palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to find out about her, and the man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite, king. This is somebody's daughter. This is somebody's wife. And he says, go get her for me. Your Highness, this is the daughter of one of your closest friends. I don't care whose daughter she is. Your Highness, that is Uriah's wife. Uriah is one of your mighty men. He's one of your best lifelong friends and warriors, a man who has risked his life for you many times. I don't care whose wife she is. Go get her for me. And the servant had no choice. And likely Bathsheba felt she had no choice. And they spent the night together. They probably spent several nights together. And then he gets a message. I'm pregnant. Meanwhile, his mighty men, who he should have been with, including Uriah, they're out exhausted and bleeding on the battlefield. They're trying to conquer a walled city. And so David decides, I can manage outcomes. And he tries to manage the outcome, but then he just makes it unbelievably worse. He just takes an already bad story and he just adds another bad chapter, and another bad chapter, just like our tendency, men in particular. We tend to try to manage the outcomes of our bad decisions rather than just coming clean or facing the stink, facing the discomfort and awkwardness while there's still an opportunity to recover. Instead, we just add more bad chapters and bad stories, and David should have known better. And he did know better. Even his servants, who just tried to delicately dissuade him, knew better. But David is going to handle the outcome. He's the king. So he sends the messenger to bring Uriah in for battle. Like, Uriah, hey, how's it going out there? Tell me what's going on. Well, things are going okay. Hey, since you're already here, just have a little bit of R&R, spend the night, go home, be with your wife tonight. That way, when it will look like Uriah's child when it becomes public that she's pregnant, David gets up the next morning, and he finds Uriah sleeping out by the palace gates with the servants who are sleeping on the ground. These are the ones that are there to just protect the king. And David's like, Uriah, what are you doing here? I sent you home. And Uriah is he's just such a righteous man and a valiant warrior leader. Uriah is like, okay, the ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents. My commander Joab and my Lord's men are camped in the open country. How could I go to my house and eat and drink and make love to my wife? As surely as you live, I would not do such a thing. He's just such a great man. David's like, okay, I just need you to stay one more night. And they feast. He gets them good and drunk. And then he points him towards home and says, go home. He's thinking, I'm controlling outcomes. But he wakes up the next day. Uriah has once again slept on the ground, on the mat, outside the palace gates. And then King David writes a note to Joab, the commander on the field. And in it he wrote, put Uriah out in the front where the fighting is fiercest, and then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die. He writes the execution note, he signs it, and he seals it, And then he gives it to Uriah, knowing that Uriah is so trustworthy a man, he'll never open it. And at this point, if we're honest, we go, okay, God, seriously? This guy? Honestly, we would expect God to just interrupt and go, okay, David, time out. Remember the thing about your king and your kingdom and your throne forever? Yeah, we're canceling that. Like you can't be my guy. You're out. But God doesn't do that. And then to cover up the adultery and the betrayal, David arranges for Uriah to be killed in battle. Bathsheba is pregnant. She mourns. David marries her. And again, in a slave culture in the palace, there were no secrets. Everybody knew what David had done. She has a son. The baby dies. She mourns again. She gets pregnant again with David. And the text tells us that she gave birth to a son, and they gave him the name Solomon. Now, just a little more backstory because you seem interested. Uh, David, David had 7 or 8 wives and at least 19 sons. So 7 to 8 potential mothers, 19 potential candidates to be in the lineage of God's final king. And you know who you would not have chosen to be in the succession of the future Messiah, God's final king, if you were calling the shots? I mean, you and I, we would not have chosen Bathsheba and her son. And that's Matthew's point. That our Savior came from a long line of sinners. And most of us would argue sinners worse than us. God chose Solomon, who should never have been born in the first place, at least not to David, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. In fact, Matthew, again, it's amazing. He never even says her name. He just forces us into the story. And for us, it's like, okay, this is not a very Christmassy message, right? Can we just jump ahead to shepherds and fields watching their flock by night, and an angel of the Lord showed about them, and glory to God? And it's like, Matthew, you're ruining the Christmas story. And I think Matthew would say, I'm not ruining it. I'm including you in it. Because this isn't just a story. It's your story. It's my story. It's history, and we're a part of it. This is God wading into the chaos that humanity created. The chaos of sin where we've hurt ourselves and we've hurt people around us, and then we're hurt by other people, so that we end up hurting other people. That this is God wading into the chaos of humanity to do something in the world, for the world, in spite of the world. And Matthew would tell us, look, if you'll just read the rest of this document that I'm writing, if you'll just follow me as I follow Jesus through his life, God will do something in you, for you, in spite of you. Matthew reminds us that God was so committed to his agenda that he still kept his promise through Abraham the deceiver, the dishonest, Judah who sold his own brother into slavery, through Rahab the Canaanite prostitute, through Ruth the Moabite, the product of a people born of incest, through David, the power abusing, murdering adulterer. None of these stories are pretty, but they're epic. And they're epic for our sake. For our sake, because Matthew highlights the misfits and the embarrassments, because that's who our King came from. But more importantly, that's who our King came for. For sinners like me and like you. Jesus, who was nothing like us and yet came for us in spite of us, and yet loves us. And knowing Matthew's backstory, it makes perfect sense that he would start this way, because he remembered the day that Jesus approached him while he was in the act of being a traitor to his God, his nation, and his people. And Jesus simply said, follow me. And he did. Where did he and Jesus go? Well, Matthew tells us, we went to my large house. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting with him at my table, sharing a meal with him, with a house and a table, with a house packed and a table surrounded, with people who were sinners just like me. And yet outside the doors were all the religious people who wouldn't even step foot inside. All the Pharisees and Sadducees, but the rabbi, Jesus, he sat there among us as one of us, eating and drinking and laughing and teaching, not afraid or reluctant to associate with sinners like me. And this is the message that Matthew, for the very beginning of his document, he wants us to know, he wants us to hear that this is the gospel about that the gospel that he's about to roll out for us. He wants from the very outset for us to understand this, that the circle of God's mercy knows no boundary. And the people who Jesus was most frustrated with were the people who stood on the outside looking in, saying, how can you associate with those kind of people? Instead of the people like us, the religious people who are getting it right. And yet, even for those of us who are wired more naturally to follow the rules and not break them, and be a good person and do the right things, I mean, isn't it true that you and I would also be on Matthew's list? Because at some point, we've all lied. We've all cheated. We've all hurt others. We've all been disloyal and unfaithful. We've murdered people's self-esteem with our words and our actions and how we treated them. We've murdered the reputation of others with our words, our criticism, our gossip about them behind their back. We've all crossed lines that we shouldn't have crossed with our sexual behavior. We've all broken promises. And perhaps as you consider your story of failing and falling short, it can be so easy to be tempted or to fear that we fell or that we have fallen too far, too short. But Matthew assures you and me, oh, no, 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 no. I was a thief. I was a liar. I impoverished my own people as a tool of the Roman Empire. There was no one lower than me on that day, where I was literally at my tax collector's booth doing the very thing that put me on the outside of the realm of temple worship, outside my family, outside the ability to be friends with other righteous Jewish people. I was actively betraying my God and my people, and yet when I looked up into the eyes of Jesus, I saw in them unbelievable love and compassion. And with just 2 words, follow me, it changed everything forever. The rabbi from Galilee invited me right there and then to follow him, me, a sinner like me. And never gotten over it. Now here I am, a former tax collector and a traitor, and I am getting to do something beyond my wildest imagination. I, Matthew, get to document the life of not Jesus the rabbi, not Jesus the teacher, but Jesus, God's Son, God's final King, my Savior and Lord, the Savior of the world, for all who would come to know and trust in him. So what if Matthew's right? What if what Matthew says is true? What if the angel said is true, that he came to save his people and to save us, to save you and me from our sin? What if that's true? Well, then just the proper response. Matthew says, here's what you do. You just do what I did. You just follow. Just follow. Matthew records for us one afternoon that Jesus looks at a group of people who were broken and weary because of what had been put on them, what they were dealing with in life, because of what they'd done or what people had done to them. And he says, come to me. Just move in my direction, all of you who are weary and burdened. Talked some with the team this morning. There's a lot of us. We're just tired. He says, come to me. Come to me, you who are weary and burdened, maybe because of choices that you made or choices that were made for you. For those of you that carry the guilt or the burden of shame or the burden of branding, the burden of what other people have said about you. And I will give you rest for your heart and your mind and your soul. He says, take my yoke upon me and learn from me. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. Sit at my feet and learn what God your Father is really like. Learn from me how to treat other people. Learn from me how to see yourself. Learn from me how to see others. Learn from me how to find purpose and meaning. Learn from me. That's what a disciple is. It means they learn and they follow. They sit at the feet of someone, they say, teach me, and I'm going to do my best to follow you. Jesus says, just learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart. And if you do, over time, I will make you this promise. You'll find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That you'll find rest on the inside, in spite of what's going on the outside. And isn't that what all of us long for the most? To just be able to breathe, just feel in our mind, in our body, and soul rest. Rest on the inside, regardless of what's going on the outside. So, this is the message of Christmas. It's the invitation of our King, who came from a long line of sinners like you and me, for sinners like you and me. And Matthew just wanted us to know before he got to the old little town of Bethlehem, great joy of great joy for all people. He wanted to know that it is great joy for all people, including sinners like you and like me. So let me pray as the band comes up. Father, I'm so grateful that Matthew took the time to name names as he did. Because for most of us, if not all of us, Father, we know there's a standard that you have, and whatever that standard is, we don't meet it. Just be able to have this knowledge, to hear of those that you use to ultimately bring about your Son. It just becomes one more of so many ways that you've offered to assure us that you do genuinely, you know everything about us, and yet you love us, and you don't just love us. That if we're willing to just open ourselves up to you, that there are things that you want to do in us and through us in this world and make a difference in the lives of other people. I pray for those of us that we tend to hold back because we know we're flawed, we know we're imperfect, and sometimes we're afraid to talk about our faith. But Father, this just serves as a reminder that it's not about us and our ability to be good or keep promises. It's about your ability to keep your promises and to love us in spite of ourselves. And so, Father, I pray as we move into this new year that you would give us the courage, the assurance, and this peace that Jesus talks about, from just being assured of that you are with us, that you are for us, and that through us, that Father, that you would write us into the story to make a difference in this world. And I pray all this in the name of Jesus.